In a remote and ignored village, nestled between majestic mountains, stands an imposing mansion and, especially, a strange statue garden, made up of a labyrinth of cobblestone paths and squares, adorned with noble yet austere stone sculptures representing all kinds of gods, kings, and animals, as well as ornate fountains, hedges, benches, and majestic colonnades and pavilions. This garden extends beneath a grove that grows denser the farther away it gets from the mansion, making its boundaries difficult to define, and beneath a sky that always remains inexplicably gloomy. Over the years, all sorts of sinister stories have been woven around this ghostly place. The townspeople are always willing to explain the legend surrounding the gloomy mansion and its garden, as they are the main attraction for the few visitors who make it there. The elders tell that they were built more than a century ago by an enigmatic and wealthy man, who was said to have made his fortune in America through shady business dealings and now wished to settle there. The magnificence of that residence and its mysterious garden of statues only amplified the locals' rumors and suspicions about this individual, who was rumored to study the occult and practice unknowable rituals with the help of a single servant, who could be seen many nights wandering around the garden lighting candles in the lanterns and carved stone niches scattered throughout. That state soon became, despite its beauty, a place of ill repute. Until one day, its strange owner disappeared, never to be seen again in the village, and the imposing mansion and its gloomy garden of statues were abandoned to decay and desolation. However, the townspeople continued to avoid approaching that gloomy estate, especially at night, for they told with fearful voices sinister stories about mysterious luminescences and disembodied voices, even about inexplicable disappearances, for they assured with vivid terror that now, among the dark and leafy trees that surrounded the labyrinthine cobbled walks and squares of the garden, some unfathomable and malevolent specters or demons lurked, always ready to capture and devour the souls of those foolish ones who entered the gloomy forest, abandoning the stone paths that on the other hand seemed to inexplicably change their layout, and through which some nights a shadowy and ghostly figure could still be seen walking through the garden under the impassive gaze of the statues, lighting the candles scattered throughout it until it disappeared into the thicket, and that those candles were in fact the only thing that protected the careless people who walked through the garden from the uncertain and threatening presence that lurked among the trees. Many years passed, until recently, the ill-fated property was acquired and restored, and the mansion became a summer camp, the main attraction of which was its now splendid statue garden. One day, a large group of teenagers arrived at the estate to participate in a summer camp, and their noisy and irresponsible behavior soon earned them the animosity of the locals. On the first day the young people had the opportunity to know the renowned garden, guided however by their instructors, who that evening, during the activities after dinner, told them the legend that surrounded it and begged them, adopting an attitude of seriousness and severity that surprised the youths, not to venture into it on their own, especially at night, because they had experienced inexplicable phenomena, and even without taking that into account, the size of the garden and the lushness of the trees that covered it meant that not even the gardeners knew its true extent. But those stories and the warnings from the instructors aroused the curiosity of some of the teenagers, both boys and girls, even more, especially to see the ghostly servant who lit the candles and to check if there was indeed some kind of presence lurking in the thickets of the garden. So a group of young people, ignoring the instructors' warnings and inflamed both by mere curiosity and by mocking challenges to their courage, began planning to leave the mansion where they were staying one night unseen and venture into the garden. The ideal opportunity to carry out this thoughtless plan presented itself a few nights later, and the youths did not hesitate to seize it. Silently and stealthily, they left their lodgings without any of the instructors or their companions noticing their escape, and gathered in a square a safe distance from the house. There, seated on benches around a small fountain and surrounded by elaborate stone vases and grotesque carved figures, amidst lush and ominous vegetation, the young people spent some time boasting about their feat. That joy, however, abruptly ceased when some of them saw a faint light coming on a short distance from where they were standing, and they even made out the movement of a dark figure disappearing behind some statues. Some of them suggested that it must be the instructors who had discovered their plan and were searching for them. But others murmured that it was the ghost who roamed the garden lighting the candles. A mixture of fear and intrigue took hold of the teenagers, who began to debate whether or not to go toward that light. Some of them had begun to grow intimidated by the gloomy atmosphere of the garden during the night and by that unexpected apparition, and they now wished to return to their rooms, urging their companions to do so by appealing to the animals that might come down from the mountain and the risk of injury in the midst of that darkness. But others, the more adventurous, or perhaps those who longed to show off their courage to their love interests, felt an even greater desire to delve deeper into the labyrinthine, leafy garden and see if there was any truth to the legend surrounding it, and they began to mock the more timid. But then another light suddenly came on in another part of the garden, and then another, and it was ultimately the mockery and arguments of the latter that finally settled the heated discussion. So the group of teenagers headed toward the last light that had been lit, nonetheless cautiously, alert to any strange presence or sound around them. As they passed the places where the first two luminescences had appeared, they confirmed that they were indeed flickering candles inside two of the stone lanterns scattered along the paths that crisscrossed the garden, which projected a faint, ghostly light that made the darkness around the somber trees and other vegetation even more oppressive. The young people finally reached the third light, coming from a few candles inside a stone niche presided over by a disturbing sculpted figure. For a few moments they hesitated about where to continue, until one of them spotted in the distance a new light that had suddenly been lit. Overcome by a growing curiosity and the joy and courage of each other's company, they headed in that direction. A new light came on in the youngsters' sights shortly after they reached the last one they had spotted, which aroused suspicion in some of them. But these doubts were no longer enough to make the emboldened teenagers give up their efforts, so they continued with this childish chase as if it were a harmless game, laughing and joking among themselves, so absorbed in the fun that they didn't notice they were getting further and further away from the camp, heading down the garden paths that led into a hollow between imposing forested mountains, down which trails of mist descended. Their shouts and laughter resounded discordantly, like ghostly echoes, among the impassive trees, before vanishing, devoured by the oppressive darkness of the night. Until finally, the bustling group of teenagers reached a new candlelit lantern, and for several long minutes, they waited in silence for a new light to come on at another distant point. But no new light was visible anywhere. Unease and fear began to take hold of the youths, who realized at that moment that they had no idea which part of the statue garden they were in, nor which direction the mansion was located. While they looked nervously around, anxiously waiting for a new light to appear, other elements around them made them even more frightened. Unlike the part of the garden they had visited on the first day, guided by their instructors, and which surrounded their accommodation, well kept and immaculate, they were now in an area that looked much more deteriorated and abandoned. Leaves covered much of the cobbled paths. At their edges, the stone railings and columns that decorated them were partially collapsed and covered in moss and grass. Stinking water pooled in the dormant fountains. The noble statues of deities, kings, and animals had been replaced by grotesque and intimidating sculptures representing demons and monsters, visibly deteriorated by time and weather and partially covered in lichen. The trees and other vegetation seemed much more leafy and wild, looming menacingly over the small square where the young people stood. The flickering candlelight in the stone lantern made them aware of the overwhelming darkness surrounding them on that moonless, starless night, and the dome of fog descending inexorably and menacingly from the mountains, covering the valley. That sight spread anguish and panic among the teenagers. They began to desperately search for some light in the distance, and to ask each other in an agitated and hurried manner if anyone saw anything, any light, the camp, or remembered how to get back there. The darkness beyond the dim candlelight and the threatening darkness of the surrounding thicket dissuaded them from straying too far from the small square where they stood. Fear and nervousness soon gave way to anger and bitter reproaches from some of the youths toward others, particularly those who had been most in favor of undertaking this foolish adventure, accusing them of not having memorized the route they had taken from the mansion to there, provoking the wrath of the accused. The shouts and reproaches quickly led to heated arguments, and the ruined garden square was soon dominated by a confused uproar that echoed through the thicket, between the mountains in the unbreakable darkness of the night. Then two of the girls in the group, engaged in a particularly heated argument, began to shove and push each other in a furious rage, and had to be separated by several of their companions, who with difficulty managed to calm them down. The tumult, however, gradually began to subside as the excited young people, who, absorbed in their foolish disputes, had remained oblivious to their surroundings for a long time, began to notice the unrest, the murmurs, and the furtive movements that had been growing unnoticed among the dense vegetation that surrounded them. The terrified youths, breathing heavily, then remembered the stories they had been told about the specters that lurked in the woods surrounding the garden, and about the candles placed along the paths as a protection against them, so they gathered together before the dim light cast by the lantern in the square, anxiously watching around them for the disembodied movements and the disquieting whispers proceeding from the sinister thicket, while they desperately sought some way out. But all this turmoil didn't seem to be going away, and it was visible wherever the young people looked, so they began to become panicky and desperate. One boy, overcome with anguish, began shouting at the formless presences to go away and leave them alone. He picked up a rock and threw it with maddened fury into the undergrowth, uttering profanities. He then approached the edge of the square, throwing more rocks and continuing to shout abuse at whatever was lurking in the trees, and several young people joined him in his efforts. Driven as much by anguish as by terror, the boy jumped over the ornate stone railing that bordered the square and went a few steps into the bushes. He broke off a branch and, brandishing it vigorously, continued threatening and insulting the lurking but elusive specters. Some of his companions urged him to leave and return to the square, but the young man was already out of his mind and did not listen to them. Suddenly, the excited boy felt himself grabbed by rough, bony hands, causing him to stagger and fall heavily onto the dead leaves. The branch that had served as his improvised weapon disappeared into the darkness, and the frightened youth realized that a ghostly limb, covered in black robes, seemed intent on dragging him into the dark depths of the forest. Terrified, the boy began to scream and kick desperately, struggling to free himself. Two boys ran toward him and, grabbing his arms, managed to dislodge the shadowy creature and drag him out of the undergrowth. Another girl then cried out that behind some columns and statues, more livid, cadaverous-looking hands had appeared, wriggling across the stone surfaces. All of this caused the terrified teenagers to irremediably succumb to chaos and absolute panic. Overcome by the madness of the most uncontainable terror, the young people began a frantic and disorderly flight along the cobbled paths of the ill-fated garden, screaming and thrashing about, unconsciously scattering through the labyrinth, where numerous flickering lights had begun to appear, toward which they directed their misguided steps. In the midst of their confused race, the two girls who had been fighting ended up meeting, and without saying a word, and almost without realizing it, they ended up running together, leaving aside their now banal quarrels, united in the shared desire to reach the lights that were appearing in different parts of the garden in the hope of escaping the nightmare that this senseless adventure had become. Others of their companions, whom they stumbled upon during the desperate search, joined them. The small group eventually reached a new path, wider than any they had seen before, and also cleaner and in better condition, flanked by eerie-looking statues, hedges, and lush clumps of flowers. The presence of the specters that had been stalking them from the grove didn't seem to be felt there, so, exhausted, they rested for a few moments from their mad flight. When they had partially recovered their breath, the young people looked around, not only expectantly for any sign of threat, but above all, searching for some light or other sign that would indicate where the rest of their companions were or the summer camp to which they fervently longed to return. The two girls who had quarreled took advantage of the brief recess to apologize for their previous behavior, and it was in the midst of their reconciliation that one of their companions pointed out that some lights could be seen a short distance from where they were, more numerous and intense than any they had seen up to that moment. Another young man suggested that it might be the mansion where his other friends and their instructors were, and that conjecture ardently rekindled the enthusiasm and hope of the troubled youths, so the group of teenagers headed there with renewed spirits, following the avenue. They thus reached two obelisks that rose on either side of the path, at the beginning of a wide staircase flanked by steep slopes of carved stone blocks, which descended into a circular hollow, also surrounded by similar walls topped with dense vegetation. The youths descended the staircase to the bottom of the hollow, several meters below ground level, which formed a large cobbled plaza, surrounded by two small canals at the foot of the slopes through which water flowed, rumbling from numerous ornate metal spouts. On the other side of the circle, just opposite the end of the staircase, the two canals converged in a fountain adjacent to the wall, covered by a small roof supported by columns and presided over by a demonic and terrifying stone face whose open mouth poured a mighty jet of water into the fountain. But it wasn't the sight of that unexpected but beautiful place that would completely paralyze the surprised teenagers, but rather the terrifying and gruesome scene they found there. Several of their mates lay inert, scattered across the floor. Their features were twisted in grimaces of absolute horror, and their skin looked gray and dry, shriveled, like empty shells. In front of the fountain stood an abnormally tall and thin figure with disproportionate limbs. It appeared to be dressed in ragged, 19th-century-style clothing, and its features were shocking and cadaverous, with pale skin and wisps of sticky hair. Its eyes and mouth were holes of unfathomable darkness. Its hands firmly held the head of a boy who was struggling in agony, trying to free himself from the brutal grip. His sickening kicking gradually ceased until it ceased completely. The vile creature dropped the inert body to the ground in disdain, its gaze shifting to the still paralyzed newcomers. The despicable specter emitted a high-pitched, ethereal shriek, its features twisted in a chilling expression somewhere between anger and perverse joy, and it suddenly launched itself toward the group of young people, striding with clumsy, swaying steps, even occasionally falling to the ground and moving on all fours before rising again, stretching its bony arms toward them. The young people were seized with utter terror. They uttered screams of panic and turned to flee. But to their dismay and horror, the staircase by which they had descended to that place of perdition had inexplicably disappeared, and where it had been, there was only a wall of large stone blocks. The demon, for its part, had begun to emit all sorts of disturbing shrieks and blood-curdling guttural moans, and with its echoing sound, the teenagers felt their fear fade and their will waver, and they stood paralyzed, watching as the hissing abomination inexorably approached. Only one of the two girls who had been fighting, who had been the last to enter the square and was closer to the wall than the rest of her companions, seemed able to overcome the spell cast by that demon and, desperately, attempt to scale the slope surrounding the square. But it was almost vertical, and the blocks that formed it were fitted together with millimetric precision, leaving barely any space between them. Overcome by anguish and terror, however, the girl did not give up and undertook the arduous climb with energy that arose from her own desperation, struggling to fit and secure her hands and feet in the tiny gaps, climbing meter by meter, ignoring the pain in her limbs, the wounds and the blood on her hands, and turning a deaf ear to the chilling sounds heard behind her. The tenacious girl had almost reached the top of the wall when, suddenly, the blood moistening her aching hands caused her fingers to slip from a gap between two blocks. But the stubborn young woman didn't fall, for unexpectedly, a strong arm, with a rough, skeletal hand, grabbed her at the last moment, lifting her like a lifeless doll to the top of the slope and pushing her some distance between the bushes that topped it until she was left, exhausted, on the grass. The girl, still panting, slowly opened her eyes, fearful of what she might find in front of her. She had hoped that the person who had helped her had been one of the camp instructors, but the image that formed in front of her was that of one of the livid specters that had been stalking her companions and her from the thicket of the woods surrounding the paths of the cursed garden. There were more of these disturbing phantoms around her, whispering and watching her. Fear seized the young girl, but exhaustion and terror itself prevented her from moving. However, the pale beings did nothing to her, and little by little their ghostly murmurings, although devoid of understandable words, were somehow inexplicably allaying her fears, and she began to feel that she had been mistaken all along, and that she should not fear these creatures, despite their disturbing appearance. Then the specter who had helped the girl out of the hollow gently took her hand, and between his cold and rough touch, the increasingly trusting girl began to feel in her mind a chaotic succession of foggy images and feelings that her savior was transmitting to her. She thus knew that the wealthy gentleman who had built the house and the garden of statues more than a century ago was in fact a demon who had been roaming the world for countless years until he had finally settled in that place to establish his own lordship in the form of that labyrinthine and enigmatic garden of statues. For the garden was truly a liminal space, a place outside of reality itself and where space and time ceased to exist, always changing and without any kind of limit, the domain of that spirit. And she also learned that the legends the locals had been telling for over a century were false, cunningly twisted by the demon's own malice. The candles he occasionally lit weren't meant to protect the unwary who ventured into the garden from the specters that dwelt in the surrounding grove, but rather to draw them to its center, the square from which she had miraculously escaped, where the demon now dwelt, feeding on the souls of those who strayed there. And so the ghostly beings lurking in the thickets of the garden weren't the formless threat the camp workers and townspeople had spoken of, but the spirits of people who had managed to escape the voracity and malignancy of the demon that lorded over the statue garden, but whose souls had remained trapped in that disturbing liminal space. The distraught teenager then realized how wrong she and her companions had been during their escape. The ghost's intention all along had not been to cause them any harm, but rather to try to prevent the evil spirit that ruled the garden from devouring their souls. But she also knew at that moment that this meant there were only two possible fates for anyone who ventured along the garden paths: to have their soul devoured by the demon that ruled it, or to become one of the hissing ghosts that dwelled in the dense trees that surrounded the labyrinthine paths of the statue garden.